After a few weeks of a spring break here in 2025, we are back. And welcome back to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Shimi Wynn, your host. So great to be here with you all. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode. I want to just take a moment to just thank folks for reaching out to me over these past few weeks. I've been really feeling the care and the community support. Myself personally in my life, I have been moving through the seasons, both figuratively and literally. We're now in spring of 2025 and the year has certainly flown by. Many of you have reached out after I shared a little bit about my cat Nugget, my familiar of almost 18 years. And we had a really, really sweet ceremony on the day of his passing and got to send him off in really strong fashion. My heart has been so full with the folks who have reached out, sending me care. Some folks have sent me photos of, their cats as well. And just makes me so grateful. Just want to start off every episode here on the Psychedelic Passage podcast with a level of gratitude. Wouldn't be able to do the work that I do every day if there weren't folks like you. Myself and my team at Psychedelic Passage, we try to pump out a lot of care and a lot of support in the world. And it just feels so meaningful to feel that coming back to us. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And so great to be here with you again. We'll start off this episode with our Q&A from our listeners. This person wrote in and asked, can you choose who is going to be your facilitator? It'll depend. I think this will depend on the route of service that you go through. Certainly here with our matchmaking and concierge service with Psychedelic Passage that connects you to our referral network of facilitators. Usually people are given different options. We try to provide at least 2 or 3 different options depending on people's needs and preferences. I know that this is the same and the case for many operators in the regulatory environments. In Oregon and in Colorado, there should be an opportunity for folks to choose their facilitator. I think also there are a few organizations that have a multitude of facilitators, and depending on availability and timing needs and things like that, you may have a facilitator, quote unquote, assigned to you. I think that regardless of what pathway you go down, it's just important to know that you have a choice. You should be selecting who your facilitator is. And this work is deeply personal in nature. And so I find that the most impact in therapeutic psychedelic work comes in being seen and supported and held by somebody who aligns with your needs. And so thank you so much to that community member who sent that question in. So today we are going to talk about a topic that comes up pretty regularly. We try to interface with folks and have lots of conversations around therapeutic psychedelic use. And today's topic will be about psychedelics and sleep. Now, I am certainly not a sleep scientist. I am not a scientist or a medical or mental health professional by any means. But I do know that there is a interesting dynamic and relationship between psychedelics and sleep. Most folks are inquiring about the following. Why do psychedelics make me feel sleepy? Why do I yawn when I'm taking psilocybin? And just general questions about how psychedelic use may affect sleep. For the purposes of today's conversation, we'll be focused on psilocybin and psilocin, the active ingredient or the active, psychedelic compound in magic mushrooms. But just keep in mind that there are different types of psychedelics, and they all have different effects on our sleep patterns, both before, during, and after psychedelic use. We'll focus on psilocybin because that's the majority of what our audience is focused on and curious about, though there's certainly other ones out there. Also, that When people are reporting feeling drowsy or sleepy, just know that this isn't the case for everybody. Some folks actually experience quite a bit of energy and wakefulness, but we'll still explore some theories and possible reasons why in case anyone encounters this themselves. Myself personally, I've had times where, I've had a dose of psilocybin mushrooms and I've felt very wakeful and alert. And there are other times on the same batch, the same strain, where I felt extremely sleepy. And so this is probably a situational basis for you as well. So, what we'll do today is we'll talk about ways that this can show up, sleepfulness or sleepiness when using psychedelics. We'll just talk through some potential theories and reasons on why this might be the case. And then we'll end with some tangible, actionable thoughts on what to do about this. Okay. And so let's dive right in. So, different ways that this can show up for folks. I'll share a couple of stories of just some reports that we get. Sometimes we see folks getting tired during the onset of both a microdose or macrodose, usually within about 30 to 45 minutes or so. I had this one particular individual that I was supporting who had reported that they would take their microdose in the morning, go on a walk or a jog or a run. And by the time they came back, almost like clockwork, they knew that they had to go down for a 20 to 30-minute nap. So the onset of when the psychedelic medicine starts to take effect, whether you're in microdose or macrodose, within about that 30 to 45-minute time range. We also see sleepiness and the getting like tired and drowsy effect coming in the middle of a macrodose experience. I think that's a little bit more situational, and we'll talk about that. But usually, what I see are people at the tail end of their experience, with psilocybin experiences lasting anywhere around 4 to 6 hours, fairly predictably within that time frame. And usually it's in the last hour and a half to 2 hours, maybe, where an individual may get really, really tired and sleepy. I've also seen this in the afterglow period, which is kind of that transitional period from where folks are, the effects of the psychedelic medicine are lessening. They're coming into a sober state of reality. And sometimes that afterglow period can bring on a little bit of a sleepfulness as well. Those last two are a little bit specific to during the psychedelic experience, but certainly people can report that their sleep cycle and pattern can often be dysregulated. Now, some people state that psychedelics, especially serotonergic ones, I'll kind of list them off, tryptamines such as psilocybin, psilocin, DMT. And people are also reporting this with other types of psychedelics as well that are serotonergic, like phenethylamines, that's like mescaline, peyote, 2CB. And then also, I'm going to say this wrong, lysergamides, which are based off of lysergic acid, like LSD. I think anecdotally, I find that LSD has way less of this effect. Most people are reporting having difficulty and issues actually falling asleep. And I think a part of that reason, I saw a research article that talked about how the way that LSD binds to our serotonin receptors, it just hangs in there for a much longer time, which may increase actually the duration of the experience. But serotonergic, meaning that all of these different classes of psychedelics affect our serotonin receptors in some type of way. And mostly what we're talking about are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Serotonin being the one that we'll talk about later, having some effect on our sleep regulation. And so, what I'm highlighting here to get back to what I'm discussing is that many folks will report having their sleep cycle altered or adjusted or almost interrupted in the few days after a psychedelic experience. I think probably a little more psychosomatically or maybe psychospiritually, there are people who also experience a little bit of like trouble getting to sleep, especially leading up to large dose experiences. But I think that that's more like anticipation. the anticipation of the psychedelic experience and what might come up as a part of it. So those are the different ways that I've seen the interaction between psychedelics and sleep. And I do want to talk about some potential reasons why I think this might be the case. Again, I am an amateur at best around scientific discussion with psychedelics, but what I'll do is I'll share a couple of things that I thought was intriguing. And I'll start with a more scientifically oriented approach. And then I think I'll move into, I think, a little bit more of like the philosophy around psychedelic work and using psychedelics for healing and how that may impact our altered states of consciousness, including sleep being an altered state of consciousness, right? And so I'll start by sharing a study that I saw on Psychedelics Today, which spoke about altered function of the brain, including temporarily altered brain waves while you're on a psychedelic experience. So this study was published in July of 2022 by Golden and Chatterton. And what they did was they examined brain activity in mice while on a significant dose of psilocybin. And what they found were two pretty interesting things. They found out a lot of stuff in this study, but I'll zero in on two specific things. And this is actually pretty interesting because many people report that the psychedelic experience, especially with psilocybin, can almost initiate a dreamlike state of being. Regardless of whether you're feeling sleepy or not, some folks find this correlation to this like dreamlike state. And what they found in this study was that delta, theta, and alpha brain waves, these are the slowest brain waves based on frequency in our brain. Those delta, theta, and alpha brain waves became even slower. And what this means is that it signifies a shift towards deeper states of relaxation and possibly drowsiness and sleep, potentially indicating a state of deep sleep or meditative state. We also see these brain waves being affected when folks are meditating or in, a mindful state as well. The other interesting thing is that they also potentially saw an increase in gamma brain waves. And gamma brain waves are the fastest brain waves that we have. And usually this is associated with periods of time of intense focus and thought. Think you're trying to hit a deadline or you're extremely focused on a game or a sport or something in front of you. That's when we would typically see gamma brain waves operating and moving faster. So these are typically associated with enhanced cognitive function and awareness, whereas slow waves are more responsible for information flow between distant regions in our brain, while faster gamma waves enable information flow within local regions of the brain. So what does this mean? They theorize that because the slower waves were slower, further parts of our brain were not operating or were not in communication as much with each other, whereas gamma waves were increased, meaning localized areas of our brain were communicating. So what they theorized was that this may reduce what they call top-down brain processing. And so in the context of brain function, top-down processing refers to how the brain uses prior knowledge, information, expectations, and prior information to interpret higher level cognitive processes and make sense of sensory information. So what this basically means is that our pattern recognizing part of our brain, we are filling in the gaps so that we can move at a faster and rapid pace of cognitive function. Now, that's helpful because it's almost like the RAM in your computer. If the information is preloaded, you can then access it more so that you can get the function done, right? The downside of this is that we are relying on pre-existing stories and beliefs and perceptions and rules and laws that we create for ourselves in order to inform our present functioning. So like how we are conditioned to be afraid of snakes if we see like a cord or a hose or a rope in the grass. Our body is conditioned as a survival mechanism to be able to identify that as a potential threat, right? So that's an example of not only evolutionary tactics or a survival mechanism to point out how this is useful in our evolution and human existence, but also an example of top-down brain functioning. So in summary, what this means is that there's kind of this dual process happening. There's the increase in the capacity for enhanced processing and awareness while being in a deeply relaxed state, and also lowering our mind's tendency to fill in the gaps or process information, usually using what we already know. And this potentially in combination of the lowering of the default mode network, which in very simplistic terms is our brain's filtering mechanism, filtering in information that we find relevant to our human experience. There's a lot of stuff happening in your brain, essentially, while you are in a psychedelic experience. So a side effect of this can for sure be sleepiness. And what is interesting is that likely this altering brain function is happening regardless of whether we are asleep or awake. I don't think that there is any evidence that us actually falling asleep during a psychedelic experience would negatively impact this process. And my theory, pure theory for myself, is that this enhanced brain function or altered functioning of the brain just requires more fuel because it's operating at a higher capacity. Probably more glucose and sugar to fuel the, serotonergic process, and likely more oxygen needs to get sent to the brain. And so my theory is this is why some folks report yawning and drowsiness and feeling tired at the onset of psychedelic experiences, because your brain is shifting from its default state into the altered state, right? And so that's one area of focus that I want to have here. And then the other, which I already spoke about or alluded to, are these psychedelics' impact on our serotonin receptors. And the long and short of this is that I'll say is that serotonin for these specific types of psychedelics, I listed them off earlier in this episode, they seem to impact not only our psychedelic experience, but we know that serotonin also affects our mood, our appetite, our sleep regulation, and a number of other like rhythmic processes in our body. And so it would make sense that certain psychedelics, like tryptamines, for example, psilocybin and DMT, for example, can affect the way serotonin affects our brain. Now, if you're hearing the word tryptamine, you might also think about the word tryptophan, right? Which they are somewhat related. Tryptamine refers to kind of the molecular structure of these psychedelics, and I believe tryptophan being, I believe it's an amino acid that can create some sleepiness for us. A lot of folks think about, eating a turkey dinner or something, like that. I'm gonna look that up really quickly. Yeah, tryptophan is an essential amino acid that the body cannot produce and must be obtained from diet. I just want to make sure I wasn't speaking out of turn there. So there's certainly a relationship there. So that's a little bit more of a scientific approach on what I think is happening here, but certainly there is what I believe a psychosomatic and a psychospiritual note here. And what I am talking about is the interaction of our unconscious and conscious mind and conscious self via the non-specific amplifier effect. Now, folks hear me mention this non-specific amplifier effect quite regularly. To me, as I define it, and one of the beauties of therapeutic psychedelic work is about bringing content from our unconsciousness and somehow crossing the threshold into our conscious mind so that we can come into better access with these things in order to address, process, or heal from them. Best example that I have are people who say, yep, I've been in therapy for 20 years, I've been on medications. I can only go so far in addressing my issues and my traumas through my cognitive lens, through my mental lens. And it seems like there's something under the surface that's still stuck in there. So if there's anybody who can relate to that statement that I just made, you understand this relationship between the unconscious and the conscious, at least, and then the non-specific amplifier effect, both in microdosing and macrodosing, can help to support this process. So what I think actually happens sometimes is that sleep can be a very, very useful state of being when you're dealing with content that has come up from the unconscious or content that is very uncomfortable and that your conscious mind is not used to it. And maybe that content that comes up is actually deeply threatening to you. Now, we as an evolutionary species, most of the time when we feel under threat, it would be very difficult to sleep, right? Because sleep represents a vulnerable state of being. This is why in the early years, I would imagine, of our human evolution, we banded together. We foraged together and hunted together and ate and slept and lived together, right? An evolutionary advantage. So just what I'll share is that anybody who has ever felt a panic attack or ever felt unsafe or ever felt under threat, you're not going to be able to fall asleep. Unless you're like me, who very randomly, sleep is one of my like trauma responses. And as I joke with my partner, I think about like how that's probably one of the healthier ways maybe to address trauma as compared to other things. And so when I'm talking about this psycho spiritual effect with the unconscious, bringing up things into our conscious mind, well, I've seen in my own work with clients and my own psychedelic experiences that many folks who encounter, let's say, a challenging piece of content, whether they recognize it as challenging or difficult or not, sometimes a state of sleep can enter in as almost like a coping mechanism. And maybe not just a coping mechanism, but I believe it can be almost like a buffer or protective mechanism. I've had experiences myself and have supported other folks through experiences where something really challenging came up in their psilocybin experience, and they knew that it was a big, hairy, challenging thing that was difficult for them. And at some point, they got tired and sleepy and actually fell asleep. I think in my own experience, it was, if I could track time, maybe about 30, 45 minutes. I think for one client I'm thinking about in particular, it was like maybe an hour to an hour and a half. And when they woke up, and I report this myself with my own experience, they weren't sure what it was, but they felt like something shifted within them. And so this speaks to the philosophy that I think is so important in psychedelic work, that you don't have to relive your traumas and your experiences in your conscious mind in order to process them. And oftentimes when folks are feeling tired or feeling sleepy in a psychedelic experience, I really invite people to lean into that. There's no evidence that shows that the potential therapeutic effect of psychedelics are diminished when you're sleeping. And furthermore, I think that many folks who approach this from a very heightened state, like folks who are ready to go to war with their biggest demons, or folks who just know that they have big content in their lives, oftentimes they're ready to put their armor on and go to war, but what is actually really required in that moment is a lot of easefulness. What's required there is a lot of softness. What's required there is actually moving through that state while being very cozy and very comfortable, maybe almost being held. And so I do think that being held, I mean like emotionally and, holding the space there. And so I do believe that sleep can be a very, very therapeutic component to this. Part of it might be able to have an effect of almost like shielding our mind and our being from that really, really deep work. I think sometimes it might be a little bit of a coping, like escapism mechanism. But I think for the large part, the best advice that I give to folks is to not resist this feeling of sleepiness and tiredness in psychedelic experiences, which this shifts into more of the practical and tangible. So we talked about how this might show up in your psychedelic experience or engagement with psychedelic use. We've talked about potential reasons why this might be the case as far as how your sleep is affected by this. And then now we're talking about, okay, what to do about this. And I'll add before we jump in here that when we are also talking about your sleep cycles and sleep patterns being disrupted a little bit, most of what I am theorizing here is that there is likely some type of like almost like REM like sleep effect, given the brain activity and the brain waves that are often recorded in psychedelic experiences. And that probably just like throws people off a little bit. Even large dose experiences, some folks come out and they either get the best sleep of their life, or some folks come out and they actually have a lot of trouble sleeping, for that night. Both of which is normal, and both of which can be productive, because I know that people who are experiencing a little bit of restlessness and inability to sleep, sometimes they use that time to like reflect on their psychedelic experience, or just be in the state of being of the afterglow, or even doing some journaling or some art or something to help to express components of the psychedelic experience that may not be coming out verbally or linguistically. So the first thing that I would tell folks is don't worry. The dose is still in effect, even if you take a nap or fall asleep. I think this is also the case about microdosing. Some folks are wanting to approach microdosing, as a way to increase their attentiveness and their alertness and some of those things. But just remember the gradual effect of microdosing, in that you may not see the results of a microdose a day after, or 2 days after, or 3 days after. But if you look back over a period of maybe 3 to 4 to 6 months, you will notice these subtle differences and changes in your life. And I would venture to guess that your relationship with sleep might potentially be positively affected there too. This is also the case for macro, as I mentioned, people falling asleep during the trip and then still reporting beneficial effect. I think the other, tangible piece of what to do about this for microdosing specifically is to consider adjusting your dosage time. So most people will microdose during the day, but if you are finding a level of sleepiness and it's really disruptive to, let's say, your work life or whatnot, then considering possibly adjusting your dosage time to the evening. Maybe you're getting off of work and transitioning into home environment. Or some folks will actually adjust their dosage time to about an hour before sleep, hour before they rest. I also think that there's possible efficacy around a split dosage, where people are maybe taking a half or 3/4 of their dose up front, and then possibly 2 to 4 hours later, they may follow up with the rest of their microdose on that day. And even a slightly smaller dose may affect the different interaction with feeling sleepy during the onset. I think more practical advice is that all of this presents an opportunity for you to pay attention to your sleep cycles, pay attention to your sleep patterning, your relationship to sleep, your changes as it relates to sleep and your sleep habits and patterns, and just your overall energy. And the reason why I say this is kind of twofold. One is that folks who are going through a lot of grief or trauma, or who have had hardship in their life, many of those folks are just tired. Many of those folks are just so tired, and they feel like they have this ramped up nervous system when they are in this constant fight or flight mode, or feeling like they are just trying to survive to the next day. And so that wears down your nervous system, that wears down your body. And I think that we are also, this is the second thing, coupled with a society and a culture that has actually really demonized sleep and rest. We are a culture that is based on productivity and output and going out there and getting it and alphas and, all of that stuff, where we're told that the less we sleep and the more we grind, the more positively will be regarded in society. And also, there's a little bit of a social commentary here about BIPOC folks and Black and Brown folks, where I learned in my own Vietnamese culture that taking a nap in the afternoon is actually embedded in our culture. We've all heard of, siestas and some like Spanish culture. And what's interesting there is that sometimes this correlation between like productivity and grinding and not sleeping has associated people to being lazy when they're actually resting. And so give yourself permission to rest. That's my main thing. Rest is often not the enemy. If anything, you should be trying to find ways to rest and recharge yourself because life is hard and you've been really going through it. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive. And again, we have to find a seat of safety in our lives, in society, at work, with the people that we love, if we need to go down for a little bit of rest. And so it can be very common for people to be like, I'm getting tired in the middle of the day. My sleep patterns are all thrown off. I got to get back to it. I got to stop this. I got to stop feeling sleepy. When actually what I think it is the invitation to actually listen to our body, because our body will tell us what it needs regarding sleep, regarding food and diet, regarding the things that we engage in, regarding the people that we hang out with and spend time with, right? So a big part of psychedelic healing is finding ways to fill our cup back up, finding ways to nourish ourselves. And so if you find yourself in any of these scenarios that I spoke about regarding psychedelics and sleep, my biggest piece of advice for you is give yourself permission to rest, because ultimately it'll start with that permission. It'll start with that choice to say, it's okay. I'm not any less because I'm resting. And actually, I might deserve a little rest because I've been going through it. So before we wrap up this episode, I will read a couple of testimonials from our community, one about our concierge service and then one about one of our ceremonial programs. This first one about our pathfinding calls, the individual said, "The help I received and the information that I was given was above and beyond my expectations, as well as a courteous and informative experience. The call taker answered all my questions in depth with extensive knowledge on the unorthodox and unusual questions I had presented versus the usual questions that they receive regularly, I'm sure." And then one about our ceremonial program, this person wrote, "My facilitator was incredibly positive, kind, supportive, and competent throughout the process. She made me feel that she genuinely cared about me and kept me safe during the ceremony." Thank you to those individuals. Thank you to our team. And thank you, our listener. That wraps up this episode of the Psychedelic Passage podcast. Remember, you can find us anywhere you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify primarily. We put videos up on YouTube. Please give us a subscribe and a follow there. And you can check out more of our work. We're very, very proud of it at www.psychedelicpassage.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.